Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Welcome to this Red Talk. My name is Maarten van Aalst. I'm director of the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. And we're here today on Earth Day. So we'll be discussing climate risks in times of COVID. We are all facing an unprecedented global crisis, as UN Secretary General Guterres also called it earlier today. But at the same time, we're also facing another pressing crisis, the environmental crisis, the climate crisis that is also coming our way. And we're already feeling the heat of both at the same time. Those people in the Pacific islands of Vanuatu and Fiji, for instance, were already hit by a cyclone while practicing social distancing to avoid COVID from spreading. So our discussion today will be about what we can do to manage the dual crisis coming together in the coming months, but also what we can do to create a better world after COVID, what we can learn about how we deal with crisis, and how we can strengthen our global response and our national response, and especially our local response, to be better prepared and more resilient for what's coming our way. So I'm delighted to have a wonderful panel with us today, and I'd just like each of the speakers to briefly introduce themselves. Cara, can you start? Cara, you're on mute.
Sorry. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Maarten. I am Cara Siahaan. I'm working for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in Geneva. I support our local Red Cross to use science to plan and to finance local action ahead of a disaster, supporting those who are most at risk.
Great to have you, Cara. Next up will be Cristina Bennett, CEO of the START Network.
Hi, Martin. Thanks very much. Happy Earth Day, everybody. Yes, I am from the START Network. We're a network of 53 civil society members working across 5 continents to both prepare for and respond to disasters.
Great. Thank you for joining us. We were due to have someone from Mongolia with us today, but unfortunately, due to technical difficulties, he's not there. But we do have Vitum Biko from CARE and also the Resilience Global Partnership.
Hi, everyone. My name is Vitum Biko Chinoko from CARE International, based in Malawi, but working for Southern Africa. My focus is food, nutrition, and climate change advocacy. Good to be here.
Great. Again, thank you for joining. And last but not least, those people really helping us all confront the massive load of multiple disasters colliding at the same time, all the time. The United Nations Secretariat for Disaster Risk Reduction, Loretta.
Hello, everyone. My name is Loretta Heber-Girardet, and I'm the Regional Director for the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction in Bangkok. I cover 38 countries in Asia and the Pacific region. Pleasure to be here.
Great. Thank you so much for joining. Not the least countries that you cover there in terms of already even now facing those risks, but also numbers of people facing those risks in the future. So great you could be there. And it's been wonderful here, Mami Mizuturi, the special representative for the UN Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction, also being very, very vocal about how COVID is already interacting with disaster risk and also how we should be thinking about reducing those risks over time in the future. And it's interesting to see on Earth Day especially that there is that momentum of actually linking these things. So we are confronting a crisis today. People at the front lines just have to cope already with COVID. We'll have to cope with then the additional shock, for instance, of an extreme weather event. And we'll be discussing a little bit how that works out in practice. But it's critical that we also learn about what makes them resilient now, maybe what we have not done enough in the past, and we should be doing more of in the future. And maybe also draw some lessons of how we can use the finance that will be used for economic recovery from COVID in ways that leave us more resilient in the end. So I really look forward to hearing from these amazing speakers. And let's jump right in. Cara, if I may start with you. Can you say a bit about how climate change is already making the work of the Red Cross and Red Crescent harder in coping with disasters, and also how COVID is now adding to the complexity of those challenges?
Absolutely, Maarten. I think we humanitarians talk a lot about emergencies, and climate change for us is a humanitarian emergency. So last year we commissioned a study, The Cost of Doing Nothing, that looked at how climate change could impact humanitarian needs. We found that international humanitarian needs could double, with 200 people needing urgent, life-saving humanitarian assistance each year by 2050, unless we take really urgent and drastic action. And this was really a conservative estimate. It does not take into account the impacts of climate on conflict, and it only looks at disasters that would require an international humanitarian response. And we know that most disasters are dealt with locally and nationally. The people who suffer the most are and will continue to be the world's poorest, those who do not have the resources to protect themselves from disasters and who, more often than not, live in areas where climate impacts like floods, droughts, and storms hit the hardest. In this challenging time of COVID, the very same people who are vulnerable to the impacts due to the impacts of climate change are also the ones at risk of getting affected by the virus. People who don't have sufficient access to healthcare, people who are unable to physically distance because they're living in slums, cramped dormitories for migrants or refugee camps, and of course, as we know, the elderly people and those with underlying medical conditions are also identified as those at risk. And you have seen in the media how hard the Red Cross and Red Crescent volunteers all over the world, from Italy to Indonesia, working day and night to support these people already affected by COVID, or to prevent the increase of more cases to happen globally. Not only that the workload of our volunteers are massively increasing, there are now more restrictions in places to make the work even more challenging. How do you organize evacuation spaces where people have to distance? And how do you protect actually the volunteers who are really in the front line supporting us to deal with this crisis? So it is evident that disaster and the impacts of climate change don't stop because there is a pandemic. So we will continue to anticipate, prepare, and respond together with our volunteers. And today, in the context of COVID, this need to act earlier to ensure people's safety and enable people to take action ahead of climate shocks has never been more critical. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Cara. And it's good to hear that that commitment. Clearly, the challenges, but also that push to be smarter in light of the rising risks, and especially at the front lines. I want to acknowledge our global audience. Of course, we're facing these disasters all around the world. We're facing the climate crisis around the world. We're facing COVID around the world. And today we've been joined already by people from, just to name the ones I see here in front of me already, Turkey, Tunisia, Australia, Nigeria, France, Egypt, Mali, Senegal, Malaysia, Somalia, United Arab Emirates, Lebanon, Mozambique, India, Kenya, Iraq, Ethiopia, Cote d'Ivoire, United Kingdom, Uganda, Switzerland, Tunisia, United States, Spain, Bangladesh, and Germany. So a very warm welcome to all of you who are tuning in. And it's great to have you with us for this discussion today. Please send us your questions through the various social media channels, and we'll try to come back to the panel at the end of this to try and respond to some of your comments. Of course, also just use those social media channels to get your voice heard. We really appreciate, especially the local nature of many of these challenges, and it's wonderful to have such a rich audience with us today. Speaking of those local realities, let me switch to Cristina of the START Network. Your network of organizations is responding to disasters affecting millions of people every year. Many of those shocks don't even make the news. So you're responding to invisible disasters to a global media audience. Yet often it's the highest vulnerabilities in those unseen cases. And increasingly, you are also acting early, ahead of disasters, rather than just responding to those unseen disasters. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and particularly also how you're using that approach to humanitarian support in times of COVID-19?
Yeah, thanks very much, Martin, and great to hear that there are so many people from all over the world on this in this session, because the way we see things is there are small to medium-sized crises happening all the time everywhere. Most of them we are not aware of as a global audience because they don't make the news, as you said. But that is precisely where START Network's niche is and where we've been operating. And a few years ago, we actually added anticipation or preparations or early action for emergencies to our portfolio of response. And what that means is that we've tried to get fast funding out to organizations before a disaster happens, to be able to prepare for it, to be able to address harm and loss before it even happens. Alongside that, we also put together a platform of experts called the Forewarn Platform, which stands for Forecast-Based Warning Analysis and Response. And that network is a combination of humanitarians and scientists and academics, all with different areas of expertise in anticipating certain types of disasters. And so together, we make up this kind of way of triggering a response before a disaster happens in order to allow communities to prepare for it and reduce the risk that they're going to be affected by it to a great extent. So the other learning that we've been doing over the years and in some of our experience with other diseases and pandemics is about the treating misinformation very sensitively and involving communities at the forefront of anything that we do. That is from a lot of learning that we've done on Ebola, where the spread of rumors really hampered the ability to respond. And certainly we're facing that now with this idea that 5G has somehow been responsible for coronavirus. And similarly, we also know that communities are best placed to do screening, are best placed to put in practice social distancing, because they are the ones that are trusted by communities. Community leaders are trusted by communities to send those messages and to be the ones to put those things in place. So we work very much at community level. So all of this learning, the anticipation, the information, and the community level responses is all pulled together for our COVID-19 response. And what we did at the very end of March is we launched a fund dedicated to COVID-19, where we are handing out money to our member organizations to anticipate the effects of coronavirus and to respond to the effects of coronavirus, but very much focused on community interventions and very much informed by our platform of epidemiologists through our Forewarn platform that inform not only the types of interventions that we fund, but also the level of funding needed for those interventions to have an impact. So far, we've been able to fund 14 different alerts in 14 different countries, but we've had an enormous demand on the funds so far.
Great, thank you. And really valuable, particularly what you emphasize also about the need for that local action and the trust, also in light of various speculations even about information going on. If people want to be able to act early, they need to be able to trust what they're told is coming their way. So thank you so much. I'm going straight to Vitumbiko. You are representing here, you're with CARE, actually one of the START Network members, if I'm not mistaken, but you're also here for the Insu Resilience Global Partnership. And that partnership has been working together between government, civil society, and a range of other multilateral partners, academic partners, to shift from a reactive response to disasters to one that plans ahead, do investments in pre-arranged finance for early action, response, and recovery. How is COVID-19 affecting these new funding mechanisms, and how is the pre-arranged finance playing a role now in the COVID-19 response? Vitumbiko, we don't hear you yet.
Thank you for having me in this forum. First of all, I want to say that what we've seen is a very serious parallel between... Hello?
We can hear you. Please continue.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Hello?
We hear you well.
Hello? Hello?
It may
You can hear me, good.
Oh yeah.
All right, thank you.
Continue.
Yeah, so I was saying it's interesting to see. It is interesting to see that we are in this crisis, in this double crisis of climate change, and we've been bombarded by this global crisis. It is interesting to see how the world has come together to contend this challenge of COVID-19. But at the same time, like you've rightly noted and others have noted, that we are also fighting one of the challenges that has always been there for quite a long time, and that is the challenge of climate change. And it is very important to remind ourselves that even as we are fighting the challenge of COVID-19, climate change is still happening. So even when we defeat the COVID-19, climate change is actually waiting for us to deal with it. So in the end of the day, I think what is be very important for us is to ensure that what is happening around COVID-19, which is extremely important, and I think it is an emergency, but it is also important within that space to recognize that climate change is also a threat. And therefore, our hope is that I think as we're dealing with this challenge, we don't forget that we also have a crisis around climate. And I'm aware of the fact that this year, governments are supposed to bring up plans on how they want to implement the Paris Agreement. And these plans were supposed to be submitted end of this year. Now, those plans may still be under construction, but I'm just looking at one, the political will around that, but also the technical focus around that, because now almost everyone now is focusing very much on COVID, which is a threat, but not, for example, in the same timelines as climate is. So in the end of the day, I think one of the things that we need to be telling our policies, our policymakers, but also people that are working on the ground, is that I think we need to keep momentum on both ends, because both of these issues are very important. So one of the things that have actually been worrying me is that as we're mobilizing resources as IGP, we're engaging governments to ensure that we diversify our risk management and not just around responsive and reactive response, but indeed into a proactive and also strategic investment through mechanisms and the instruments like insurance, that will not actually diminish. And I'm really hoping that that won't go down, because in the end of the day, like I was saying, climate change is happening as we're talking now. So that is one of the things that I'd really hope that we keep our eyes on and ensure that we don't neglect or focus on climate. And even at country level, our action is, can we focus on those plans that we're supposed to present in November and make sure that those plans, in any case, are no less ambitious than the plans that we're supposed to submit if we had not had COVID-19. So that is one. And I think, speaking directly to the question around financing, I think what we've depended on in IGP is the goodwill of our developed countries. And most of these developed countries, as you have noted to date, are the ones that have been worst affected by COVID-19. And my worry is that I think it will be very hard to push for climate financing argument. And I'm just hoping that I think we can put a narrative out there that these things are not fighting each other, but these things are actually complementing each other. So this is something that I really want to put out there, that when you're fighting climate change, you're actually also helping those that are actually on the front line. So indeed, speaking to the point that Kara made earlier on, and we've always worried, for example, in the Global South, wondering what would happen if some of the slums were hit by the virus. I think the impacts would be so enormous. So in the end of the day, these are also the communities that have been affected by climate change immensely and disproportionately. So it is very important, I think, that we take that into account, and even governments, as they're mobilizing, not to dampen the political will, to mobilize climate financing, and more so around climate insurance and other mechanisms which have been new. I also want to call on governments, for example, to continue, especially the developed country governments, to continue to make some contributions to the adaptation fund, because usually after these catastrophes, those kind of funds tend to suffer contributions, and I hope this won't be the case around COVID. But we're also hoping that within the IGP, we've been able to develop some tools, which we've made those tools available to NGOs, we've made those available to governments to be able to use in instances like the health emergency like COVID, which also falls under a very under risk, climate-related risk to a great extent, because we've seen, for example, how weather plays again into the severity, but also the whole infection trends around COVID-19. And I think there's that strong link between COVID, the spread of COVID, and also the climate. And this is why even the global south, where I am, for example, now, we're very worried around what is going to happen when we hit winter. And I think it's in that realm, for example, that we would really need a lot of pre-arranged financing around climate change, but also around COVID-19 response.
Great, thank you so much. The needs are very clear, and your call to the world to step up to those needs is also very, very clear. Loretta, if I may turn to you, your Office for Disaster Risk Reduction in the United Nations has probably made those calls to invest in risk reduction beforehand, to understand our risk, but then also address our risk proactively, and not just in the context of disaster management, but also in how we shape our development like no one else. I guess with the crowning achievement being the Sendai framework that we're all trying to follow. You must be going through a particularly rough time knowing what's coming our way in terms of natural hazards occurring everywhere, but then also seeing these additional risks appearing now. What tough risk management choices have people had to make already? And what are your lessons for people that are now trying to shape our response to the current crisis, combined crises of COVID and the natural disasters coming our way?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of today's panel. It's such a critical issue. How do we manage both the impact of COVID-19, but also not lose sight of the fact that climate change is continuing to wreak havoc on our countries, especially here in Asia Pacific, where I'm sitting, where 68 million people were affected by disasters last year. Most of these were climate-related disasters. You mentioned the Sendai framework, so maybe let me just start off by saying that this is the global framework on how to reduce risks. And most of the countries in the region that I cover have national strategies, and they're very much focused on climate risks, but they're not including biological risks, including this pandemic, that should be included into their strategies on how to reduce disaster risk. So this is already a problem that we see out there, is that we've been working in silos. On the one hand, you have the national disaster management authorities and ministries of environment dealing with climate change. And then on the other hand, you have other sectors, in this case, the health sector, focusing on pandemics, but we didn't see them as both combined as creating risks to countries. And this is something that needs to change. Now, very specifically, regarding your question on what have been the challenges that we've been seeing, I think the very first challenge is, of course, countries are needing to prepare for their usual round of climate-related disasters, such as typhoon season, which is now hitting most of the regions, at the same time that they are responding to COVID-19. This is, of course, a big challenge for disaster management agencies that usually have limited resources, but also they're having to manage the trade-offs between the types of containment measures that are being put in place for COVID, such as social distancing, and their typical responses, which would include evacuation, for example, in camps or in schools or in where people would have a close proximity to each other. And in the case of Typhoon Harold that we saw in Vanuatu, they did ease social distancing as part of the evacuation. However, there was a very low rate, almost non-existent in terms of COVID-19 in that situation. If something similar happened in a country like the Philippines, where you have a high level of infections, we would have a very difficult way of balancing protection from the typhoon and protection from the virus. So there's a lot of reviews going on right now in countries of how do they change their preparedness planning, their contingency planning, so that they're able to manage this. And of course, we're thinking about typhoons because we're entering typhoon season. But let's not forget some of these other hazards that are also linked to climate change that are very deadly, such as heat waves. Heat waves in urban settings, for example, where people who are confined to their homes, and when the temperatures are so high, will have a very high mortality rate associated with that. Now, what are we learning from COVID? Because I think that's the second part of your question that we'll be able to use for other disasters. It's a very good question. And I think one thing that we see very clearly is that those people who are impacted by climate-related disasters most negatively are the same that are most negatively impacted by COVID-19. In other words, the most marginalized members of society, those who cannot socially isolate themselves because they are day laborers. They rely on a daily income in order to survive. So they are forced to expose themselves to the hazard. Women who are being forced to remain in homes where perhaps they're with an abuser. We are seeing a big increase in sexual and gender-based violence as well. And we know, of course, that older people are not only more vulnerable once they acquire the virus, of course, because of their own physical status, but also social distancing is leaving them isolated and having an impact on their mental health. So what we need to do is really tackle the underlying vulnerability that really makes certain groups much more impacted by all sorts of disasters, whether it's a pandemic or whether it's a climate-related disaster. And the way to do that is to scale up social protection systems, cash-based assistance, to make sure that these populations not only receive cash once a disaster occurs, but that they're socioeconomic. That means the income that they have is sufficient so that when a disaster happens, they're not the first to really suffer the most. And I think another key lesson that we're really learning is that we need to invest more in local action and local actors. That if there is a major disaster in a country that is impacted by COVID, it's not an international response that's going to be the answer, because that's going to increase the exposure of the population potentially to the virus. So we really need to make sure that the local actors, the local NGOs, the community-based organizations have all of the tools and the support that they need to prepare for and respond to their disasters. And maybe a final word from me. I do hope that after COVID-19 crisis reaches some sort of stabilization, we recognize the psychosocial impact of responders. And that I'm hearing more now in this disaster about the impact that this virus, this pandemic is having on frontline responders. But this is something that has been around for many decades. Frontline responders not really getting the support they need in the face of any type of disasters that they respond to. And so I think that we can learn lessons about supporting those people who are preparing and responding to disasters. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Loretta. I know you have another meeting at 1 o'clock, so you may need to leave us in a minute, but thank you for your contribution. I do want to head to some interesting questions we've had online from our viewers. So if you still want to chip in, take the first cut at that. And the first one actually reminded me of your reference to the psychosocial impacts on the first responders, but I'd say also to the communities, which were also very clear in the bushfires in Australia earlier this year, where again, lots of discussion about climate change, also posing new disasters, pushing us to new limits of disasters that we haven't seen before in terms of the scale and the intensity. It's by now been clarified. There's been lots of discussions also in Australia about whether climate was to blame. Of course, climate is never alone to blame. It's how we manage risk in total. But it's clear it's playing a role already in how the bushfires played out. And then you see challenges like, you know, the season where you could do controlled burning becoming too short to even do that. And the heat becoming so intense that even the places where there was controlled burning becoming so intense that it cuts through. But also local firefighters, you know, who are volunteers. That's one of the options that allows you to have good fire response in rural communities far out in rural Australia. And being out there for 100 days in a row away from their families and businesses. So that's really tough. And the question is, at some point, when are we reaching limits of risk management and adaptation for certain places? Now, one of the online questions sorry, I need to look up. Sorry, I don't have the name in front of me anymore. Too many good questions coming in. But there was a question about the bushfires and the communities, especially that are just recovering from that. And are also confronted with COVID. Could anyone on the panel share any wisdom about how that's playing out? No one directly working on Australia. If anyone online is watching and would like to respond.
But maybe to pick up on a point about the importance of first responders and keeping them safe. And I think others on the panel have made that point before. But I think, what we're seeing in a lot of countries, most countries have some form of lockdown, social distancing, restrictive measures in place. But what we really need is for there to be exceptions for key workers, humanitarian workers, firefighters, et cetera, because if we've got either knock-on effects from COVID-19 or existing emergencies such as the Australian bushfires in place, we need those first responders to be able to be free to operate. And I think governments need to look at their own policies and really make those first responders, put them in the category of key workers that could be exempt from some of the restrictions they have in place.
Great, thank you. Any other comments? Otherwise, we can turn to a next question, which is about the Middle East and the question about the relationship between food insecurity, of course, also partly affected by what's happening in the weather and with the climate, and now also affected by COVID. And the particular question is also about an increase in food insecurity in the Middle East. I don't know if anyone can speak to that. Otherwise, there's been a very strong analysis just published today by the World Food Programme. Oh, please, Vitumbiko.
Yeah, I wanted to speak out to the issue of food security in the sense that one of the responses to COVID has been restricting movements. And we now are quite aware that I think to deal with issues of food and nutrition, it's really not about just what you grow in your local area, but also what you're able to receive from others. So in the event that, for example, one locality, one country is locked down from the other, there is actually a danger that that country may not get everything that they need. And I think that is one of the messages that we've been talking about, that food security is really about how different elements are actually interacting. So we've seen really lockdowns which have restricted food movement, and that is also directly going to affect food security, so to say. But on a practical level, I also want to mention that we have, for example, very high possibility of increased post-harvest losses because if farmers are not allowed to go and harvest because of they don't want to because of the COVID, then there's going to be a likelihood of high losses of food while they're still in the field. So I'm looking at, for example, in Southern Africa, where around some food chains, we have post-harvest losses of even sometimes going up to 40%. In the event of lockdowns where farmers are not allowed to go out, that percentage is likely going to go up. And we're talking of regions which are already, even when good rains, with everything in place, they still suffer a lot for food security, so food insecurity. So I do see that possibility of COVID contributing to food insecurity to a great extent. And it is important that when government is putting in measures, they do recognize that element and maybe put in some relief that would still allow farmers to go and harvest or in some way make sure that even when they go to harvest, they are well protected. Over.
Can I jump in as well, Martin?
Please do.
Because I do know WFP came out today and said that they were expecting, I think it was something like 265 million people to be food insecure by the end of this year. I think a really big challenge that the world is facing is that the resources that normally go to pay for humanitarian operations and food, for example, food support for organizations such as WFP, risk being diverted to deal with the COVID crisis domestically in people's own countries. And it's really important that governments around the world, and we understand very much that they are investing huge amounts of money, unprecedented amounts of money in economic programs for their own countries, but that they still maintain that cash flow that is required as a lifeline to those in the poorest countries and countries in conflict, such as Yemen or South Sudan, or these really food insecure countries. So I think there's a tremendous amount of advocacy work that's required by organizations such as the UN and the Red Cross and others to make sure that these poorest countries are not left behind and that the money is not diverted only to deal with economic stimulus packages, recovery packages for the countries in the West and in the more developed world.
Thank you. A very, very important point, and of course also one that echoes in a way from the challenge we're facing with disasters always, but that's even more pronounced now. So thank you for that very important reminder, and I think a call to all of us also on Red Talk to make that plea outside in the world. We may be preaching to the converted to some extent here on this platform, but let's all go out and make that plea elsewhere too. We're past our time. I think we've had an incredibly interesting discussion that brought up so many examples of where we're already confronting these links. That shows that on Earth Day, we are indeed one Earth, and this is playing out everywhere, from Australia to those really dire places that were mentioned already facing the food insecurity that we just discussed. So we're in this together. We can only solve this together, but we need to break silos. We need to break silos between response, preparedness, long-term risk reduction, between humanitarian and development approaches, between health-related risks and extreme weather event-related risks. And it's, I'd say, a glass half full, half empty at this point. I'm hearing lots of challenges, but I'm also hearing examples that we would not have heard 10 years ago. So I think we're heading somewhere good. The question is, can we now also mobilize what is already available to us in terms of being smarter in this crisis, but especially mobilize the momentum of the rethink that will be happening in the global system to come out better at the end. I want to give all of the speakers, say 20-second moment to give some final words, especially maybe some wishes for where we'll be heading to from here. Maybe I start with you again, Cara.
The wishes is again what has been said already in the discussions we had, really to keep on supporting the local communities, our volunteers who are in the front line working to deal with both crises, the climate and the pandemic. So it needs everyone on board. It needs great partnership between the sectors, as you said, and we are happy to support the efforts jointly.
Great, thank you. Cristina?
Yeah, thanks very much, Martin, for a good discussion. For me, it's just, I hope that you are right, that following this disaster, we have learned something from this and that our systems change to meet whatever the next problem is going to be. And that should look like early action, that should look like fast action, that should look like community-based action, and without discrimination, because we know now that if we don't combat coronavirus everywhere, we're not going to solve it anywhere. And so our actions need to be aimed at all levels of society, wherever coronavirus is found.
Thank you. Vitumbiko. Vitumbiko, you have the floor for some closing remarks.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I had connection problems. For me, my closing remarks are as follows. One, I'm really enthralled by how the world has come together around COVID. My hope is that the same momentum, the same political will, the same national mobilization and action that we've seen on COVID will actually permeate and go into climate action. And I really, really hope and sincerely hope so, that we're not backsliding anyway. So thank you very much for this forum.
Thank you. Loretta.
Well, I completely agree with what Itumbiko just said. I think we have to do everything to ensure that the recovery from COVID is not an excuse to further damage our planet. And we need to really make sure that all of the actions that are taken to restore our communities, our countries, are done in a way that help reduce the footprint of carbon emissions on our planet. And I think that, as Itumbiko just said, we have seen that the world can come together and it can mobilize very quickly massive amounts of money to respond to a crisis. So how we actually build off of that momentum and how we keep our leaders mobilized to save the planet like they have done to save their communities and their countries from the pandemic is something I think we have to focus a lot more on moving in the future, but I think it can be done.
Great, thank you. And it's exciting to see the humanitarians that are also at the front lines of these risks also being the voices for that need to look at the longer term in this day and age. And the risk-informed early action partnership that we're all part of, that is trying to bring this voice also into the climate change domain and toward the Glasgow summit next year, for instance, is one of those places where these silos are are being broken apart, and where we do see that good change happening. I wanted to share one other thing that inspired me and made me optimistic yesterday when I heard that the city of Milan, which of course has been in a heavy lockdown, is not among the most vulnerable places on Earth, but has really been hit among the worst affected. During the lockdown, of course, there was very little traffic in the city. They've decided not to allow all the cars to come back into the city, but to create huge pedestrian zones and cycle lanes, because they actually saw that their city could be better than it was before COVID. Now, that's a developed city that has the luxury of making choices about traffic, but it also shows that big changes can be made and we can come out of this crisis better. So I hope that's an inspiration to everyone around the world, and especially in the most vulnerable places. I want to thank the panelists for joining us, sharing their great examples and their good ideas. And I want to thank the audience for joining and hopefully spreading the word on these difficult challenges ahead of us right now, but maybe also these opportunities for transformation the coming year. So I wish you all a great Earth Day, and let's leave it there for now for this Red Talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.